Welcome to Practical Evidence-Based Executive Function Interventions for Language, Reading, and Writing. My name is Nancy Dressel. I'm the president-elect of Wisconsin Reads. I'm honored to be sitting in to host for our president, Donna Heitmanek, tonight. At Wisconsin Reads, our mission is to increase awareness about the impact of literacy, provide training about evidence-based practices in the science of reading, and connect interested individuals with resources. Our co-host, Kate Meyer from Everyone Reads in Pennsylvania, is not feeling well tonight and unable to join us this evening. Please check that your microphone is muted and share a brief introduction of yourself in the chat. The chat will be monitored and you are invited to ask questions in the chat. Tonight, we are honored to have Tatyana Elleseff with us. She is a bilingual speech and language pathologist who specializes in working with at-risk children with complex language and literacy needs. She has been published in a variety of professional journals, as well as presented at numerous national and international medical, academic, and nonprofit organizations. She's also a clinical instructor at RWJ Medical School and a clinical supervisor at Rutgers Day School. And she's the co-founder of CEU Smart Hub. At the end of our presentation tonight, Tatyana will be sharing a link to a feedback survey, which will allow you to download the presentation handout. Following the webinar, you will also receive an email with links to the recording, the feedback survey, and then the opportunity to download the handout. Thank you for joining us, Tatyana. We are excited to learn about practical evidence-based executive function interventions with you tonight.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for this wonderful introduction. So as Nancy has mentioned, I'm Tatyana Elleseff, and I specialize in working with children with language and literacy disorders, as well as complex psychiatric needs. So a lot of my work has to do with the field of mental health. And many children with language and literacy needs, as well as mental health needs, have significant executive function difficulties. As such, I really delved into the research, the neuroscience research beyond evidence-based practices on this topic to see what works in the most efficient way for this population. So I wanted to briefly mention that this presentation is supported by Everyone Reads PA, and Kate Meyer, unfortunately, its founder and president, couldn't be here today because she's quite ill. And this is a wonderful organization who does amazing work in the area of reading, just like many other organizations involved here, just like the organizations represented by Donna and Nancy. So what Everyone Reads PA does is they do literacy screenings, literacy advocacy, and education absolutely free. So they really do a fantastic job disseminating knowledge in the state of Pennsylvania, as well as across the country. So I'm very sad that Kate couldn't be here. So what I wanted to talk today is I wanted to talk about some research on the subject of evidence-based practices when it comes to executive function deficits and language and literacy disorders of these kids. So this webinar is actually part of a series of executive functions interventions in students with language and literacy needs. And the first free webinar on this topic is actually available. The link is available in your handouts, and that one can be accessed from this particular website. And this webinar, as well as another, as well as the previous one, are both abridged versions of a full-day presentation on evidence-based executive functions interventions for academic and social success, which, if you're interested more in that, can be found in my speaking engagements, or can be requested upon, or can be done upon request. Okay, so our goal today is two-part. We want to talk about the current research on the relationship between executive functions as well as language and literacy. And we also want to talk about evidence-based practice interventions, which are aimed specifically at improving self-talk and motivation. And I will explain why self-talk and motivation in a little bit. And this is in kids with language and literacy deficits. And there is a reason why I wanted the handouts to be available after the presentation and not before. This is a very complex and a highly dense topic. The truth of the matter is, it is not something that can be covered quite adequately in a period of 1 hour. That is why it would be more helpful to have the handouts after the fact, because you may need to rewatch portions of this presentation in order for it to optimally serve your needs. I will be happy to answer questions as we go, which are placed in the chat as we go along in our presentation, as well as towards the end. But now, without further ado, let's begin by discussing what executive functions are and what executive functions are not. So executive functions are top-down cognitive processes, and we need them for all goal-oriented behavior. I need my executive functions and activation of all of my executive functions in order to show up here today and in order to pull this presentation. The executive functions actually constitute what we call a metacognitive, supervisory, or even controlling system. They're not particularly related to specific cognition domains. Rather, it is a supervisory system which controls our goal-directed behaviors. These executive functions help us learn new information, and they're very, very strongly linked to multiple aspects of academic success, as well as vocational success, and in general, success in life. We have numerous research studies which show that strong executive functions are connected to transition to kindergarten, language and social emotional competence, school performance and social competence when the kids are older, and are generally linked to higher socioeconomic status, as well as fewer drug-related concerns and criminal convictions in adulthood. So there is a lot of evidence that strong executive functions contribute to really rather strong vocational, social, and academic functioning. Now, there is a general consensus among researchers that there are 3 specific executive functions which are very strongly involved in goal-directed behaviors. That is response inhibition, or inhibition of what we call dominant or prepotent responses, resistance to distractor interference, and resistance to proactive interference. So response inhibition allows us to basically set priorities, allows us to resist our impulses, and allows us to have, for lack of better words, self-control. A little bit regarding terminology. Prepotent responses are basically dominant responses, which essentially have become automatized or automatic. Proactive interference has to do with effect of interference of previously learned information on acquisition and retrieval of new information. So, for example, difficulty remembering your spouse's or friends or parents' new phone number after previously having memorized the old number and having the urge to constantly dial the old number, even though the new number is now in effect. That would be an example of proactive interference. And then distractor suppression refers to our ability to filter out distracting and task-relevant information, and it's incredibly important for our survival. It is a key aspect of selective attention. So, for example, distractor suppression has really, really high importance when we're driving on the road, when we're involved in high-risk activities, if we're doctors, when we're performing surgery. So that is very, very important. So in addition to response inhibition, another core executive function is working memory, and specifically the updating and monitoring what we call working memory representations. So working memory controls our ability to retain and manipulate specific pieces of information over a short period of time. But it's not just that. Working memory has to be constantly utilized effectively. So even as I'm speaking right now, my working memory is absolutely engaged in updating and monitoring what I say. And that will account for the fact that I'm not going to repeat myself excessively, but rather move on and continue with new information instead of just repeating something over and over and over again. And finally, the third core executive function, widely agreed upon by researchers, is what we call cognitive flexibility, or shifting between mental sets. This cognitive flexibility allows us to sustain or shift attention in response to different demands, and as well as to apply different rules to different settings. Now, these three core executive functions of response inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility are hugely important for language, for learning, for literacy, and we're going to talk specifically their role in reading and writing in just a few slides. All right. I wanted to briefly mention this because this question had come up in previous conversations and in previous presentations regarding the relationship between executive functions and IQ. So a couple of things. There is a strong genetic overlap between executive functions and intelligence. It is important to know that when children take IQ tests, such as Wechsler, for example, those tasks do not correlate with IQ tests. So traditional intelligence tests don't really adequately measure executive functions. In fact, we have quite a significant problem when it comes to testing of executive functions, because the question is always, how do these testing results can be transferred and functionally applied to functional interventions? Because you cannot treat executive functions directly. You cannot treat response inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility directly. It's simply not done. But there's absolutely ways of doing it in an evidence-based manner, which we will be discussing as we continue and progress with our slides. All right. So right now, the current research theories there is a lot of different theories of executive functions. There is many theories of executive functions as there are researchers who are researching executive functions. But this is something that has gained quite a bit of credence in the recent past. There is a significant advantage in categorizing executive functions specifically in two broad areas: hot executive functions and cold executive functions. So cold executive functions would have to do with the cognitive information processing, while hot executive functions will actually deal with emotional information processing. And this model is gained quite a bit of favor because it is a spectrum-like model. So it's very, very advantageous to look at executive functions in such a manner. Now, my previous presentation, which I mentioned you can have access to for free, I specifically discussed a variety of models on executive functions and why this model is superior to the other models. But since this presentation is only 1 hour, and we really have to go through incredible amount of information in that short time period, that is not something that I chose to focus on and discuss today. That particular link on the bottom in your handouts will lead you to a free open access article discussing this in detail. It is presently being updated by their writers because they found some minor errors. However, so it's temporarily not available. However, it will be there available shortly. So it's good for you to have access to that if you wanted to look at it. Now, let's talk a little bit more in a functional manner regarding cold and hot executive functions in the brain. So cold executive functions are associated with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortical regions, and they include specifically planning, cognitive flexibility, working memory, behavioral monitoring, and inhibition. Hot executive functions are mediated by the ventromedial and orbital frontal cortices, which support behaviors that require emotional awareness and regulation, empathy, and theory of mind. Okay, so we have dorsolateral and ventromedial and orbital frontal cortices. So we're going to flip a few slides back and right here. So this is the prefrontal cortex right there, and there is a dorsolateral portion. This is the orbital frontal, and this is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And it's just, these are the points. So this would be helpful. All right. So certain researchers further distinguished between hot and cold aspects of social cognition. as related to evaluating and interpreting social situations. So they referenced hot social cognition as the process which is responsible for emotion perception and identification. So for example, empathizing with somebody's affective state, or emotional empathy, versus cold social cognition involving more kind of an objective perspective. So thinking about things from another person's point of view. So hot social cognition, feeling something or empathizing with someone's emotion perception, and cold social cognition, thinking about things from somebody else's perspective. All right. In a nutshell, so what happens when cold executive functions are impaired? Well, you will see that the students will show limitations in their working memory. They will have trouble inhibiting their responses. They will have very significant difficulty with shifting their attentional control. You will see deficits specifically in the area of solving problems, not just academically, but also in daily life. You'll see difficulty in the areas of decision-making, planning, and reasoning, and you'll see deficits in the area of cognitive flexibility. They'll have some difficulty shifting between different tasks and different goals. They'll have some difficulty just accepting other person's point of view, changing their mind quickly, changing their plans quickly, and so on and so forth. When cold executive functions are impaired, we'll see that the students are showing impairments and difficulties in the areas of emotional regulation, social cognition, reward processing, delayed discounting, and decision-making. So difficulty regulating their emotions, they may have extreme reactions over not so significant events. Social cognition really refers to a very complex set of processes, but essentially they allow people to share both cognitive and affective experience of others. They allow us to predict behavior of other people, and they also allow us to communicate quite effectively with other people. So, and it also involves things such as theory of mind, the central coherence theory, empathy, and emotional recognition. Reward processing has to do with your response to reward stimuli. Are you learning from your rewards? Can you calculate and anticipate well your future rewards? And how can you engage in goal-directed behavior towards your rewards? So, and that has to do with both intrinsic and extrinsic reinforcements. This is also something that can be quite significantly involved in gambling, as well as the next point that we're about to make: delayed discounting, the act of resisting an impulse to take an immediately available reward because you're going to get a more valuable reward in the future. An example here would be what in a psychologist's books is called either the cookie test or the marshmallow test, something along those lines, where you put two little kids in a room, you give them, you show them a plate of cookies, and you say, okay, so right now this is one cookie, and this is your one cookie on the plate. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to leave this room. I'm going to leave this room. When I come back, if the cookie is still on the plate, you're going to get a whole box of cookies. So if you show me, you actually, you have some self-control and you didn't eat these cookies. You didn't eat that cookie. You're going to get all of these cookies instead. So this would be an example of delayed discounting. And then the researcher leaves the room and everybody is watching the child quite intently. And what they're looking for is not just whether the child is reaching for that cookie. They're looking also what the child is doing. They're looking whether they're using self-talk to talk themselves out of taking a cookie, whether they're glancing towards that cookie, whether they're reaching their hand towards their cookie. So they're not just looking for the ultimate, did the child take the cookie or not? They're looking at the entire process. What happens as a result of taking or not taking the cookie? What was the tipping point or the lack of a tipping point in not taking that cookie? And decision-making. So obviously, when your executive functions are impaired, you're far more prone of making a lot of risky decisions. And that is, of course, not a great idea, because this decision-making and increased risk of poor decision-making can actually result in your or somebody else's fatalities. So this is definitely something which can contribute to that. So that is something important also to consider. All right. One of the most important things I wanted to cover in this presentation, because this is something that has been going on for quite a while, is that nowadays everybody and their cousin are offering these quick fixes and executive function interventions. Many of these fixes and interventions are incredibly controversial in nature, and they don't lend themselves to evidence-based practices, but rather are what we might consider as pseudoscientific practices. So for example, there is a lot of talk and a lot of conversations that, somebody has executive function deficits, but what does that actually mean? What deficits are actually being shown? How are we judging that the kids are showing executive function deficits? Because it's such a poorly understood concept, there are a number of controversial and scientifically unsupported treatments which we need to discuss. And this includes brain training, memory training, processing training, visualization strategies, or teaching strategies instead of implementing evidence-based interventions. So that would include things like planners and clocks and timers. But the problem is they're being given to kids who have poor language and pragmatic abilities, so they can't really benefit from those strategies because those abilities are impaired in them. So they need actual quality language interventions before they can benefit from planners, clocks, and timers. So let's talk a little bit of that at length. So let's talk about why memory training doesn't work. And that is because researchers have found that working memory training programs, they basically produce what we call the near effect versus the far transfer. So the near transfer basically means you teach somebody to memorize a bunch of things, and these people seem to be able to do that. They seem to be able to spit out that information, and they may be even able to do that 3 months later. Fantastic, right? Well, here's the problem. That absolutely does not transfer into real life experiences. That doesn't make somebody better speaker, writer, reader, or even a better memorizer, because there is no what we call real world transfer of cognitive skills. So basically, somebody just went through the process of doing all of this busy work, but it didn't result in them being better, speaking better, or reading better. And that's a problem. And that's what we need is a far transfer, or in what we in speech pathology call generalization of skills. Because the point of every single therapy and goals that you want to target, you don't want things to just be functional in a therapy room. You absolutely want that transfer into academics. You want better academic outcomes. And that's really what we're striving for when we're providing these services. Otherwise, what is the point of providing them? So let's talk about processing training. So RAND refers to rapid automatized naming. So RAND, which is essentially rapid naming of colors, letters, animals, words beginning with a particular letter. And this is something which you may see on both tests of IQ, as well as a certain tests of rapid automatized naming, such as RAN-RAS, as well as certain portions of the CTOP, which is the processing test. So the CTOP, what is it stands for? Phonological assessment test. Sorry, I'm blanking out right now. It's a little bit less. So you'll see it on the RAN-RAS test, on the WISC-5, on the CTOP. The problem is that this is something that cannot be trained directly. So it's actually far more functional to provide equal hours of reading intervention, because you cannot train processing speed, but by providing good quality language and literacy intervention, you will actually indirectly improve memory and processing, and that may actually result indirectly in a rise of a couple of IQ points when you're getting retested. And it would certainly result in functional academic outcomes in daily life. brain training. We're talking about all sorts of commercially available programs. The research here focused on cognition, but there is lots of other programs which are, can be lumped into the same category, brain balance centers and gem learning. And there's quite a bit of research available on the fact that many of these brain training programs make a lot of unsubstantiated claims. And basically, what the researchers did, they tested these claims and they found out there are no benefits on academic functioning about a year post-training, as there is no benefits on working memory, attention, or executive behaviors at any age, which is 2 years post-training, as compared to the placebo programs. So again, what these programs do is that they result in the near transfer versus far transfer of skills. So if you want somebody to be a better speaker, reader, and writer, then you work on better speaking, reading, and writing, and that will in turn functionally also improve their listening abilities, because you can't work on listening skills directly. It's a lot more trickier than that. Receptive language interventions also do not work effectively as per research. So you focus on something which is you focus on something which is measurable, and that will in turn affect those indirect areas which are showing deficiency or impairment. Let's talk a little bit regarding visualization. So visualization, in the absence of strong underlying skills to support it, is also fraught with limitations. So what researchers have found out is that in typically developing kids, these visualization abilities are far stronger when they're in upper elementary to middle school grades and ages. They are far weaker to non-existent in kids ages 5 to 7 who are missing a lot of vocabulary and background knowledge, information, and so on and so forth. Now, visualization is also absent in a number of individuals and cannot be fostered. And that is actually not a problem, because what research indicates is that you don't actually need visualization to be successful in life. Some people simply do not have it. And that's very important to understand. Yes, visualization is great and it works well in certain fields such as sports and psychology, but you do not need visualization in order to improve somebody's executive functions. You can do it through other means. Finally, strategies training. If you're doing strategies training only, but the underlying skills are weak, the language is not there, the literacy is not there, it is a waste of time. That is not going to work. So that is a problem. So let's talk a little bit about executive functions and language learning. We do know certain facts. We know that the direct relationship goes both ways, and we know that language and executive function are very interconnected. So here's what we know based on research. Kids who have higher executive functions, in other words, kids who scored high on these executive function tasks on a variety of tests, and those were actually mentioned on that slide, which was discussing hot and cold executive functions a few slides back. What those kids actually have are higher language skills. And they also have particularly higher language skills in these core areas of inhibition, cognitive flexibility, shifting, and working memory. So the particulars are as such. Vocabulary, syntax, and grammar are very closely related to executive functions in preschool. Young kids who are more efficient at processing information, they actually show better vocabulary and grammatical skill growth in early childhood. Kids with good executive functions learn more words and have better grammar. That's really what it means. Syntax comprehension and production of grammatical structures really involves numerous cognitive processes, numerous executive functions. And again, we're going back to attention, memory, flexibility, and inhibition. Now, working memory is really needed to integrate information. You're doing it not just across individual word meanings, which is vocabulary knowledge, but also word functions, which is syntax knowledge. And you have to hold these sentences in memory, because these are your representations in memory. So that's again how it's connected, how syntax is connected to directly to executive functions. So this referenced executive functions in typically developing kids with solid executive function abilities. Now let's look at the reverse of that. Executive function deficits are reported in kids who have language impairments. In fact, different researchers found that early language skills had both direct and indirect effects on later executive functions. And not only that, but language ability predicted behavioral problem in kids when they got older. In other words, kids with weaker language abilities had poor executive function abilities, and in turn, they had notable difficulties in the area of behavior as compared to typically developing kids without these difficulties in the areas of language and executive functions. We know as follows. When it comes to children with language deficits, DLD refers to the moniker we use in speech pathology, developmental language disorder. It is a particular moniker we use when it comes to kids who are basically diagnosed with language deficits from a very early age. Their deficits do not resolve by the age of 5. These deficits will require intervention, and these deficits are not due to genetic syndromes or functional impairments or anything else. They're not due to intellectual disability. They're not due to being deaf or hard of hearing. They're not due to having diagnosis of autism and so on and so forth. So what we do know is that students with developmental language disorder tend to perform worse as compared to typically developing kids, not just on verbal measures, but also nonverbal measures. We know that language abilities of students with language deficits need to be improved, which will in turn improve their executive functions. Okay. All right. As we're going along, you guys, please feel free to post some questions in the chat, and I would be happy to answer them either as we go along in the presentation or towards the end. All right. Now I wanted to shift focus a little bit and discuss specifically pragmatic abilities, or the children's and adults, of course, use of language for a variety of social communication purposes. So here's what we know based on research. Kids who have better executive functions show better performance in pragmatic language, in the use of language. Conversely, kids who exhibit what we call non-autistic pragmatic deficits actually have the same executive function limitations as kids with autism. That's very important to know. So there were some French researchers, that would be bullet point number 2. They found that 4- and 5-year-old kids with higher executive function skills, their higher executive function skills were actually correlated with better language control. They had much higher working memory capacity, and they actually formulated pretty clear and sophisticated sentences, which were clearly understood by their listeners. So these preschool kids who had higher executive function abilities also had what was judged by their listeners are far more superior language abilities than their typically developing peers. Other researchers found that pragmatic deficits and narrative deficits, or your ability to tell and retell our story, are deeply connected to executive functions. And executive functions and narrative deficits, as well as pragmatic deficits, are interconnected in the following fashion. To competently tell a good story, you really need to organize your information very well. You also need to establish the connections between your sentences and your points very, very well. That means you're activating numerous executive functions at the same time. You're activating working memory, attention, cognitive flexibility, your inhibitory control, your planning abilities. All of that goes into creating a successful narrative. So when somebody is really fantastic at retelling a story, you can actually make a direct judgment into their pragmatic abilities, and you can also make a direct judgment about their executive function abilities as well. This question came from one of the participants. When reading testing reports, are there specific tests that access executive functions, or should we be looking at the working memory scores to see if executive functions might be weak? Actually, if you want to know if executive functions are weak, you can just listen to the child speak. You can listen to the child telling a story, or just what control do they have of their syntax and grammar. Because we know that there is a direct relationship between good executive functions and good language, you can immediately make some predictions regarding somebody's executive function deficits just based on listening to them speak. This is how you can easily tell if somebody has weak or impaired executive function abilities. If you want to specifically look at somebody's working memory, that's fine, more power to you. And there are subtests of the WISC, the Wechsler, WISC-5, which particularly look at working memory as well as processing. So you can look at the breakdown of those areas, and it's just going to be called, so they have verbal comprehension, fluid reasoning, visual spatial reasoning, working memory, as well as processing. And you can look at those scores, and you can certainly make predictions regarding somebody's processing and working memory. But you don't need particular tests to figure out if somebody's executive functions are weak. You just need to listen to them speak. You need to look at their language. So I hope that answered your question, Jenny. Okay. Lovely. So let's talk about executive functions needed for reading. We want to be as explicit as possible because there's lots of executive functions needed for reading. We need our attention because when you're decoding, you really want to make sure you read all lines of text versus skipping some lines of text, which is what our kids commonly do, those who are having reading difficulties. Without attention, working memory for learning cannot be activated. So before you even activating your learning memory, your working memory, you gotta attend to your stimuli. Otherwise, how are you gonna learn if you're all over the place? So you need to have, so there's lots of studies which talk about the connection between attention, including selective attention and different forms of attention, and working memory. All right. Working memory is absolutely needed, not just for decoding, because you gotta sound out words, you gotta blend words, and so on and so forth. You really need it for your reading comprehension. You gotta grab your meaning from text. You sort of have to synthesize, all right, what do I already know about this text, and what don't I know about this text? Let me update it in my mental files. So you really absolutely need that. You need to have a decent inhibitory control because you're going to see a lot of similar looking words. You really don't want to read ahead and make what we call anticipatory errors, which I also see with quite a number of our kids. So you need that in order to read exactly what you're reading while appropriately anticipating what you're reading next, versus sort of like, having this unholy amalgamation of words and sentences. If anybody wants to see anticipatory reading errors in action, I can actually, if you email me at the end of this presentation, I'll send you some examples from the reading fluency subtest of the TILS, where a lot of my kids make certain type of anticipatory errors. So I can provide those examples there. Then you obviously need self-monitoring, because what's going to happen when you're going to make a whole bunch of these errors? Does your reading even make sense? Are you going to pause and stop because you're clearly not making sense when you're reading? Or you're just going to blithely continue reading along and everything is hanky-dory without realizing your test just became completely incomprehensible to your listeners. That's very, very important. You really need your self-monitoring, because you're going to be a lot of polysemous words. That is basically words with similar meanings, words which are multiple meaning words, words with ambiguous meaning, and so on and so forth. So you got to know which one are you selecting, which one is helpful here. So you need that. You need your cognitive flexibility, because you're really coordinating so many processes. Your orthographic knowledge, your phonological knowledge, your semantic knowledge, you're making literal versus figurative interpretations. You're coordinating all of that while you're reading. It's actually quite a feat when you really think about all the complexities. Teaching reading is like teaching rocket science, to quote Louisa Moats. So we need that cognitive flexibility for graphophonological and semantic cognitive flexibility, which is essentially what we gotta do is we have to actively switch between graphophonological and semantic components of printed words. That is very, very important. So in other words, we gotta be decoding words, but automatically we gotta be grabbing meaning from those words in order to effectively summarize our information, answer reading comprehension questions, and so on and so forth. So we got to do that. So this executive function is very, very important, especially for understanding the difficulties of poor comprehenders, because they have a lot of trouble shifting their focus from decoding and reading fluency to actually being meaningfully engaged with text. This is particularly difficult for one subset of the population, and those are slow readers, or what we call slow, inaccurate readers. By the time they suffered through reading that passage, reading that sentence, reading that paragraph, it took them such an inordinate amount of time and effort. They're done. They're finished. They don't have any cognitive capacities left to answer anything related to reading comprehension. The work was simply too labor intensive and too hard. Well, again, to compare it to real life experiences, you can be sure that those are the kids who are not just having reading deficits, they're also having pretty significant executive function deficits, because all of these executive functions are needed for reading. Similarly, organization, when you need to really summarize what you're reading, but you also have to prioritize information you find in text. Heck, you need to prioritize the information you're summarizing. So that's really very, very important as well. So that is very significant. You need to discard the relevant information. And that's another process which is needed for reading. All right. A little bit about executive functions and writing. So executive functions control writing tasks. And when we talk about the writing process, we're broadly talking about three specific processes. You have your planning. You got to generate and organize your ideas. And obviously, there has to be a certain amount of transcription versus interaction of executive functions. You got to translate your writing. Basically, you are transforming your ideas into language. You're transforming your ideas into written form. And you got to revise your text. You got to make sure that your written output looks good, makes sense, ready for publication, whatever that may be. So executive functions will monitor planning, translating, reviewing, and revising in the problem-solving process of writing. So executive functions will influence somebody's handwriting. They will influence somebody's overall written output. They'll even influence note-taking and report writing, because a tremendous number of processes are involved in that. Again, they will guide the self-initiation of thoughts, affect, and behaviors for writing goals. And then the core executive functions, memory, inhibition, and flexibility, they're going to be involved in this in the following way. They're going to be involved in writing in the following way. So you need your inhibitory control when you're composing text, and you need to ignore distractions in your internal environment, but you also need to ignore your distractions in your internal environment. You really have to focus on the main topic. You have to self-regulate and reflect, and you have to make sure you're not writing down nonsense. Your working memory will help you with production of your writing, because you're building and storing text representations. So what you're doing during your writing process, what all of us are doing during our writing process, we're constantly, like a computer, updating our information and our working memory to align what we're writing with stored representations. And then cognitive flexibility allows us to assume different perspectives and to shift between revision process and continuing to write the text. It also will allow us to have certain pragmatic competence of the text, make sure we have written enough words, make sure we have separated those words into sentences, into meaningful paragraphs, and so on and so forth. All right. Now that we talked about the importance between executive functions in terms of oral language, pragmatics, reading, and writing, I want to talk about how self-regulation is pivotal and vital for executive functions, and that is very, very important. So we already know that executive functions allow us to basically control ourselves, for lack of better words. Self-regulation will use all of our executive functions. It will use our control of our attention, remembering of instructions and directions, and managing of emotional reactions and behaviors, and it will allow us to mediate our language. It will allow us to think about our language and to think about our thinking, and that would be metalinguistic and metacognition. That's what's involved in controlling our thoughts and controlling our language. So, again, all of the researchers agree core executive functions of memory, inhibition, and flexibility are huge components of self-regulation. Self-regulation will allow us to set goals, motivate ourselves, and solve problems. So within a particular framework like that, successful learning is the product of setting a goal. You're basically pursuing some form of an objective. Motivation, that's hugely important. You're not going to give up. If things get a little tough, you're going to persist till the task is complete. Even when things get difficult, you're going to activate your problem-solving process to overcome those hurdles. All the while, you're going to be still having enough cognitive capacities to devote to learning. Basically, while you're using this, you're not going to get cognitively overloaded and just give up and steam is going to come out of your ears because this is too much. So that's a very, very labor-intensive process. Now, we as adults engage in it on minute-by-minute basis. We're doing this, of course, without being consciously aware of it. But this is a skill we need to develop in our kids with weak executive function and language and literacy abilities, because we need to give them these tools so they can be successful themselves. All right. So when it talks about self-regulation and language abilities, the work on this has been around for years. Both Vygotsky and Luria, they proposed that language definitely serves a self-regulatory function by guiding goal-directed behavior to facilitate problem solving. Vygotsky specifically proposed that the use of private or self-directed speech is actually a way of guiding one's behavior on difficult tasks. I don't know about you guys, but I talk to myself all the time. I talk to myself it could be my external dialogue or internal dialogue, but whenever I encounter problems, I literally need to talk it out. Whenever I need to remember information, I need to talk it out. Whenever I have a difficult issue I need to deal with, I need to talk it out. So I use, most of the time it's inner speech, because I also don't want people looking at me funny thinking, why is she talking to herself? That is not healthy. So a lot of it is, of course, inner speech. Sometimes if there's nobody around, I'll definitely use external speech, but that's what I do. I really need to use speech to self-regulate and goal set my behavior. And most successful people actually do that as well. So it's not everybody does it, of course, and it doesn't mean if you don't do it, you're not successful. But that is a very nifty tool, because we're also going to talk about self-talk in a specific way. We're going to talk about the results of positive self-talk and negative self-talk. And we have to be very careful what self-talk we're using, and we have to be very careful what self-talk we are encouraging and allowing the kids we're working with to use. And that's very, very important. So again, kids with better language abilities are much better at using private speech. We actually have quite a bit of research on that. And they use that private speech as a self-guiding tool to show earlier internalization of private speech, and also something we call regulatory mechanisms, which result in better self-regulation and adjustment. So, components of self-regulation are several. So self-regulation is essentially our ability to deal with stressors effectively and efficiently. And then we can basically, after we dealt with stressors, we're back to our baseline. The pulse is down, blood pressure is down, we're calm. Okay, let's continue. So self-regulation is very strongly linked to what I discussed, metacognition, or thinking about thinking. And that's the process that creates the conditions to guide our thinking. So our self-regulation strategies are self-monitoring. We're constantly self-assessing. Self-talk, we'll talk more about that. Goal setting, and of course, self-reinforcement. I have to self-reinforce myself, and so do all of you have to self-reinforce yourself so we don't give up and we actually achieve goals to our satisfaction. So in order to develop this self-regulation, you need to actually actively monitor your thinking. You need to pause and check when needed to make a variety of decisions in order for students to get engaged in their learning. Now think about the complexity of this skill. Pause for 1 second. Can kids with language difficulties, can kids with reading and writing needs do this? And the answer is unequivocally a no. These skills need to be taught. They need to be taught effectively because these skills are the end result of advanced language abilities. Without having specific language abilities, and we'll talk about which language abilities you need to be successful at this, executive function is not going to improve. It's not going to get better. You need certain prerequisite tools to create a strong executive function foundation. This is very important, but it's not going to come out of a thin air. It needs to be explicitly and systematically fostered. It cannot happen otherwise. There is no magic in this. Just like phonics instruction needs to be explicit, systematic, and intensive, these skills need to be taught just like that, explicitly, systematically, and intensively. Self-talk. It's a very powerful self-regulation strategy. Trust me, I assure you. Internal or external self-dialogue, we are routinely using it. All of us typically developing individuals, and we're using it for a very specific purpose. We're using it to complete cognitively effortful tasks. It is vitally influences academic performance and well-being because self-talk allows us to control our thoughts, which in turn allows us to control our emotions and behavior. So instead of getting, when you get angry, instead of throwing chairs around and going, throwing a huge tantrum or engaging in fisticuffs, which is what can routinely happen in my setting because I work in a psychiatric hospital, so it's a very familiar scene to me. My job is to teach these kids how to not do any of that, but how to instead use self-talk positively to change their thoughts, change their behavior, to control their emotions. And we need that. So there is quite a bit of CBT that goes into this as well. Positive self-talk is controlling and regulating our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's going to help us tremendously. It's going to help us improve our self-esteem and self-confidence. It's going to help us work more efficiently. And it's also going to help us attain difficult-to-reach goals. Now, let's talk about negative self-talk because so many of us and the kids can routinely engage in negative self-talk. And that is literally the worst thing you can do. The worst thing you can do is to energize the negative. Now, negative self-talk has causes, and some of those causes are pretty significant. Some of those causes are coming from places of depression, anxiety, unhappiness, low self-esteem, low confidence, all of that. Negative self-talk, the problem with it is that it always results in poor outcomes, I assure you. If you are negatively talking to self, you're basically going to give up, or you're basically going to engage in a loss of control of your emotions and your behavior. You're going to get dysregulated. Your thinking process is going to go completely haywire. Your feelings and behaviors will be out of control. You'll have lower self-esteem and self-confidence. You're not going to be an efficient worker. It's going to decrease your working efficiency very significantly. In fact, it's going to be incredibly difficult for you to start working or even get out of bed. How many kids who are poor readers and writers who are doing so poorly in school, how many of those kids have so many somatic complaints in their hopes? God, don't let me go to that school. This is the place which is so difficult for me. This is the place I hate because it makes me feel dumb. It makes me feel stupid because it makes me feel bad because I'm not getting the right type of help. This is very powerful negative self-talk, which unfortunately reinforces negative behaviors. And that is something we want to avoid at all costs. It's incredibly difficult to attain any goals, much less, to even any goals. It's just going to be so difficult. So in order for us to develop a positive self-talk and what we call productive self-talk, because there's different kinds of self-talk. I only mentioned positive and negative, but there's actually quite a few. There is also instructional self-talk, but I don't have an opportunity to talk about this in this presentation due to a lack of time. So, self-talk needs to be explicitly taught. It requires advanced language. You need to teach kids insight and introspection in your own strengths and needs. Prerequisites to self-talk include the following. Kids need to have advanced syntax. They need to have knowledge of what we call literate vocabulary. They need to have what we call solid discourse competence or solid ability to hold a conversation and tell a story at their grade level, not just socially, but truly at their grade level. They need to have very strong meta-linguistic awareness abilities, strong reasoning skills, and of course, they need to have good pragmatic competence. So again, we need to teach this in a context of speech pathology services, and I talk a little bit more in depth how to do that in the first part of this presentation, which is linked in the first couple of slides. I talk a little bit more about that, but obviously for the purpose of this presentation, it was not possible. But these are the prerequisites which will lead to the place where you can teach students how to do that. In the meanwhile, let's take a look at self-talk in action. So what you can do with kids, for example, with adolescents who have attained that ability. So in other words, they have the prerequisite language abilities, but they're still struggling a bit, maybe, with good grades in areas of academics because of disorganization, weak executive functions, but like the foundation is all there. The house has good bones, then you can do as follows. You will use your dialogue and discussion as both the object and the medium of intervention. So for example, I choose adolescents because I do that with a number of my adolescents who've been in therapy for a while. It's a very effective technique that works with them. You basically ask them questions to foster a lot of self-reflection because then they need to use a lot of executive and regulatory behaviors. What's the nature of the problem you're having right now? I want you to state your problem. Where are you going with this? What are your choices? How do you feel you did with that explanation? Judge your own strengths and needs. Judge what you need to, judge how you did on this task. So you're teaching self-talk as a way of analyzing, planning, and organizing and regulating communication. So you're basically teaching somebody, okay, this is how you recognize if you're having a communication breakdown. I want you to understand why something needs to be done. And I want you to explicitly know what can be done about this. So you're basically providing somebody with a particular approach to regulate their thoughts, which will in turn regulate their emotion and behaviors. And what happens is that person becomes equipped with more powerful tools. They'll start having much better self-confidence, self-efficacy, and so on and so forth. But what you need to teach somebody is not just insight, but also reflection. Because without reflecting on how you did, without reflecting in your strengths and needs, and it's very difficult to transfer this knowledge and strategies to new situations and tasks. Here's a perfect example that I heard today from a 6-year-old I've been working with. He's 6, he's a bright little guy. Yes, he's in my psychiatric setting. Yes, he has some needs. Yes, he's a poor reader, but the little guy is improving very, very significantly in a very rapid period of time. He's been taught self-regulation strategies through self-talk. Look, Miss Tatyana, I'm getting better at reading. I know that because I couldn't do that last week. And he goes into explaining to me how last week he was not doing so well with these CVC words containing the short, sound. And this week he's doing so much better, and so on and so forth. In fact, the poor kid actually threw a tantrum when he had to go back after his 30 minutes because he wanted to continue working longer. But he's using certain self-regulation strategies in some areas, not in others. He's still 6 and he still has difficulties, but he's learning and he's getting much better. But he's talking and egging himself on very, very positively to talk what he's doing well, how he's improving, and what is getting better. So his motivation is there. So he's doing a beautiful job at both trying to self-regulate and motivate himself. Self-regulation, what can we do? Intervention is dialogic and interactive teaching. And we're trying to make students be active problem solvers through self-reflection, self-monitoring, and self-evaluation. We want to address the underpinnings of language, and we really want to do it well. We want to address issues of self-efficacy and self-motivation. So we want to do that. We want to talk about linguistic, executive, self-regulatory, and strategic learning needs of these students, and we want to avoid what we call decontextualized interventions. Now, because we're running out of time, I can tell you that I discussed contextualized interventions at length in my previous presentation. So you can take a look at that to see what contextualized interventions are available, which are very strongly evidence-based influenced and which are very strongly evidence-based in general. I wanted to finish this presentation on the role of motivation. So motivation is basically the process which helps us start, guide, and maintain our goal-oriented behaviors. So motivation includes a lot of different forces: biological, emotional, social, cognitive, and all of it activate human behavior. So motivation has several important components. You got to activate, you got to persist, and then it has to be intense enough to pursue a goal. So you have to make a decision to initiate certain behavior, then you got to continue with your effort, and then you have to exert enough concentration to achieve your goal. Extrinsic motivation is not that great. Extrinsic motivation basically means somebody is controlling your behavior. Extrinsic motivation is you're being controlled by somebody. There's a lot of extrinsic rewards involved in this. Money, social recognition, praise, but somebody is basically pulling your strings. You're doing this for somebody else. So you're doing this for a reason, which is connected externally. Internal motivation is the best because it basically arises from within you. It is a gratification at having a job well done. It is a gratification at doing well. This is something that actually drives and motivates you forward. Typically, when you have intrinsic motivation and your motivation is internal and it's not connected to other people and pleasing other people, and it's not connected to anything else, usually it is much better sustained and there's much more successful. So components of intrinsic motivation is basically autonomy of free will, mastery, or knowledge or skill of a particular activity, and purpose. Why are you doing this? What is the purpose of this? So here is the relationship between motivation and executive functions. So first of all, we need motivation to participate in therapy. We need motivation to get out of bed. Motivation is hugely important, and it needs to be absolutely fostered for individuals. Motivation is not an executive function, although there are some researchers who sort of connect it to executive function and kind of claim it is. But it absolutely is needed. Absolutely needs to be regulated when individuals consciously initiate, maintain, and persist towards activities. So there is rewards, which consist of two elements, wanting and liking. And there are several brain chemicals which are actually involved in motivation, which is very, very interesting. You got your dopamine, and individuals who have high executive function deficits don't tend to, they want immediate rewards. They don't really discount immediately distant future rewards. It's too far away. I want the reward right now. I want it now. And when they do cost benefit computation, they don't do so hot because they decide, long-term reward is not worth it. So they have a lot of difficulty in that area versus individuals with really good executive functions. They're like, no problem. The cost benefit analysis indicates to me that this long reward in the future is absolutely worth it to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and pursue it. Getting a college degree, obtaining a particular type of a career choice, becoming a star athlete, and so on and so forth. So obviously individuals with weaker executive functions have difficulty sustaining focus and motivation for stimulating activities, and they're going to have problems with organization, planning, self-control, self-regulation, and related issues. So they particularly require a lot of assistance in that area. So fostering motivation to individuals with executive function difficulties is really the key to getting them engaged and interactive and being able to sustain effort in language and literacy interventions. And that will ultimately benefit the improvement of not just their academic activities, but also their executive function abilities. So, in conclusion, here's some important takeaways I really would love for you guys to take from here. Executive function difficulties or executive function strength and executive function needs. Everything about executive functions is deeply interconnected with language development. The relationship is bidirectional. Weak executive functions equals impaired language equals weak executive functions. Knowing the role of strong language abilities in executive function development will allow professionals, and not just speech-language pathologists, to formulate and work on what we call contextualized, targeted, and generalizable language goals. When we attempt to strengthen executive function components in isolation from language and literacy, we will fail. It will not result in effective therapy outcomes. It will not result in effective academic outcomes. Before we improve self-regulation abilities, we need to make sure that the students have the prerequisite skills. We cannot work on self-talk and on self-regulation if our students have weak language. We need to have enough of foundational language abilities to sustain this well. Otherwise, we're basically dooming them to failure because they're going to give up too easily because they don't have enough tools in their toolbox in order to work on it effectively. Self-motivation is a hugely integral component of therapy, and it really requires to be actively fostered in students for them to successfully attain goals and improve both language and executive function abilities. Now, if anybody is interested in continuing education in this, this is where you can look for some information on this topic, and it's going to be available in the handouts. Now, here's actually how to obtain the handouts for this presentation. I'm going to take you guys right here, and it's in your handouts, and this should be, you should be able to get to be right here. And I'm also going to put it in the chat option for everyone. So this is for everyone. You can go from here, but it's essentially the link, tatyana.elleseff.com/ebp-ef-interventions-self-talk. So I will make it available to everybody, but it's also how to get it. This is also how to access it. In a couple of days, this video and the handouts will be available on this website, tatyana.elleseff.com. So all you would need to do is click on blog, and you will see this presentation, handouts, and video, and you'll be able to access that. If you want the handouts right now, this is where you need to go. Now, let me see if I need to cover anything else. Some more relevant information you can find in the handouts. These are the references, and this is a way to contact me. These are my websites, the blog, and some other features. I run a group called SLPs for Evidence-Based Practice, where we focus on all the evidence-based subjects in EBP. And that concludes my presentation.